Law and order. For many people, it sounds like this. But in politics, it means you're tough on crime, and it goes way back.
As far as this problem of law and order is concerned, I am for law and order.
Today, it's become one of President Trump's favorite phrases.
I am the law and order candidate. I am your president of law and order.
But what exactly does he mean by law and order? Well, during his first campaign, it meant a lot of things, like securing the border and cracking down on gangs. But he also pledged to reduce violent crime and support law enforcement.
America's police and law enforcement personnel are what separates civilization from total chaos and the destruction of our country as we know it.
On the campaign trail, Trump said officers would not be shot under his watch. He also pledged to pursue the death penalty for cop killers. But the number of police killed by firearms has remained fairly steady throughout the last few years, and the Department of Justice hasn't executed those who've killed cops. However, Trump has tried protecting the police in other ways. In 2017, he signed an executive order calling for harsher penalties for those who harm officers. And when Trump signed his recent executive order promoting police reform, he continued to back the blue.
Nobody needs a strong, trustworthy police force more than those who live in distressed areas, and nobody is more opposed to the small number of bad police officers, and you have them. They're very tiny. I use the word tiny. It's a very small percentage.
And lately, Trump says he's deploying hundreds of federal agents to major cities like Chicago to fight crime. Interestingly, public perception of crime rates have been wrong for a long time. While a majority of people year after year believe crime is going up, the reality is that crime has been consistently dropping for decades.
The big story with crime rates is that they have been plummeting since the 1990s. They plummeted during the Bush administration, they plummeted during the Obama administration, and they have continued to fall during the Trump administration.
But this year may be different. David Skolansky is a law professor at Stanford. He explained while crime is down overall this year, during the pandemic, several cities are reporting an uptick in shootings and homicides. Trump has put some of the blame on civil unrest following George Floyd's death, but Skolansky says it's more complicated.
Many of these things have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. The fact that people have been stuck at home may be increasing rates of domestic violence. The fact that hospitals are overwhelmed may have made some assaults that previously would not have been deadly assaults. The fact that the pandemic has caused the economy to go into a tailspin may be responsible for some of the increase in homicide. Finally, there's some evidence that the spate of police shootings of particularly young black men has led to decreased trust in the police by making it harder for the police to pursue the kinds of strategies that community policing requires.
That brings us to this week, when Trump's campaign officially unveiled its 2020 agenda. If re-elected, Trump plans to defend the police by hiring more police officers. He also wants to prosecute drive-by shootings as domestic terrorism. But there are questions over how much Trump can really handle from the White House.
Crime is mostly a local problem, and it is addressed locally and at the state level. For many years, the Department of Justice was encouraging local police departments to pursue policies lumped together under the rubric of community policing. The Trump administration slowed down and ended many of those efforts.
For example, the Justice Department scaled back a program that promoted better relationships between law enforcement and local communities. And Trump also signed an executive order lifting a ban on police using leftover military equipment. So will the self-described law and order candidate thrive in an environment with signs of rising but still historically low violent crime? That seems to be the bet he's making.
Every American must be free to live without fear of violence.
Look at what's happening in American cities. Cities all run by Democrats. Crime, violence, and mob rule.
When you are in trouble and need police, don't count on the Democrats.
Or will the rhetoric fall flat as he's the current commander-in-chief?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.